peculiar definition. At least it's a definition that I don't know that's accepted by any evolutionist. I wouldn't accept it personally, which is that evolution really goes well beyond what Darwin was talking about and goes back to the origin of life and beyond that to the Big Bang. I don't really think that evolutionists are trying to, they'd love to. It's not evolution. I think that there's a great deal that's being learned about this, but that's not ordinarily, at least, defined as any part of evolution. I think it's of some importance from another matter, though. Dr. Gish hasn't really explained at all about how we can have these fossils layered and so forth in the different ages and going from simple to more complex and just consistently having this in these geological layers specifically, and yet say that there hasn't been any evolution. He hasn't explained at all what that is. Now, the standard creationist explanation, as I've read about it, is that there was a great flood, as stated in Genesis. In this great flood, water rose to the top over the top of the highest mountain, which would be over 17,000 feet high if Mount Ararat was as high then as now. Okay, and there was great turmoil for this year, and everything was turned upside down. All the different layers of sedimentary rock were laid down. All the igneous rock, the granites and so forth, were extruded up into the sedimentary rock. Everything happened in this one year. And I guess what really seems incredible to me, but what's been definitely stated is, well, now, the reason that in the lowest levels you've got single cells is they couldn't swim or walk, so they couldn't escape the flood, and they got caught at the lowest levels. And things that could move faster got up higher. Of course, they don't really explain very well why there wouldn't be fishes at all levels when they could swim in the water. They don't really explain anything very well, but that's the idea that they do come up with. I haven't heard any explanation of tremendous, I'll say mountain of evidence, because it's mountain after mountain after mountain of evidence about the relative ages, and beyond the relative ages, the absolute ages of all kinds of creatures. He hasn't explained it. He can ask that creationism be taught in a science class when he has, my quote, he hasn't said it's wrong at least, my quote is that creation is science. And I don't, again, I say, fine, if it's not a science, let's not have it in science class. If evolution is not a science, better try to get it out. I'm convinced evolution is a science, but if it's not, it certainly should not be taught in science class. Okay, let's go to another thing. This business of gaps, which Dr. Gish talked about in a very funny way. I wish I had his sense of humor. But Stephen Gould, who was here, what, a year ago, 2 years ago, I forget, made a very entertaining talk in this room, in fact, is the chief proponent, I think, he's a professor of biology at Harvard, the chief proponent of the punctuated equilibrium theory of evolution. And this brings me to something else I better say. Evolution itself is accepted essentially by all biologists, except maybe a few that are creationists. Evolution is accepted. It's the process that we call the theory of evolution. How did it all happen? That's where the argument is. We don't know enough yet, and there's a tremendous ferment going on right now. You need something that fits the facts, among other things. That's what makes a scientific theory validatable. Does it fit what happened in nature? And really, Dr. Gish says there are a lot of gaps. It's true. There are two things to be said about the lot of gaps. The first of them is this. We'll go back to this business of how do things evolve? Ordinarily, as we understand it at least, and as we've seen things happen in the lab, a particular creature has a change in genes, a mutation. That mutation may be something that stops offspring or disables that creature so that it disappears immediately and is essentially never seen again. It may be something different that leads to something else, and that chain may keep going. This is not a real long process, at least with fruit flies. They've been able to take fruit flies through long chains of mutations in a few years. It's not something that necessarily requires millions of years to get through mutations. If the mutation is something that leads to successful reproduction and living, then that thing is going to take over. Okay, but let's say over in this little corner, one creature has a mutation that's a very successful one. Most of them don't. But this one has one that's very successful. Okay, if there's plenty to eat, and if this creature is enough superior to the other creatures around it, it's going to thrive. It's going to reproduce very rapidly, essentially exponentially. It won't have developed any enemies at that point. It will develop very quickly, and through a set of other mutations are taking place. So this thing doesn't stay just the same, but very quickly the successful mutations take over, so that in 1,000 years, 10,000 years, you have a colony, a sizable colony of something that competes very well with what was already there. Now, there's essentially a field for this. And if it's gotten to a place where it's successful enough, it spreads and takes over. So you don't see any of the steps in between unless you're extremely fortunate. They were all a very short-term basis, relatively few individuals. It's this big new wave of things which you would expect to see. And that's why you expect gaps. That's one of the reasons that you expect gaps. This is the punctuated equilibrium theory, I'm oversimplifying, of Stephen Gould. That things, instead of evolution going along a nice smooth path like this with everything leading immediately and minutely and infinitesimally to the next, that what happens is you'll be going along like this, everything in a pretty static state. And then environment changes or a particular mutation occurs, and in a short time, short geological time, it could even be as short as a few thousand years, in that short time, suddenly you've got a new level, a whole new bunch of things, and there's a gap between them. In fact, he invented the theory largely because he found that the best evidence we have is that just exactly that kind of thing is happening. That was not the old Darwinian theory that everything went rather smoothly. It was still, both of them are evolution. They're different theories of how it occurred. Okay, the other thing about the gaps is this. Right now, we have exposed on the surface of the earth, in cuts, whatever, a tiny fraction of the total land material that's been formed during the life of the earth. We can talk about that many-mile thick layer that's been formed, and we know that we're seeing just little bits of it. Most of it has disappeared. It's been eroded away, it's been ground up into, for instance, granite, perhaps ground up into sandstone, redeposited, any fossils in it would have been ground up. All this kind of thing happened, so that the chance that a fossil is going to remain and be found is really very tiny. We find a lot of them. It's almost impossible in a way that we find as many as we do. But you're certainly going to expect that even if in a place where there is a long line of succession, things very nearly the same, a lot of those are just not going to be in the fossil evidence. Dr. Gish seems to consistently take the position, if I don't understand it, it can't be. And that's, you can take that on anything, I suppose, but it's wrong. The fact that we don't understand something doesn't make it impossible at all. The fact that the best brain in the world doesn't understand it doesn't make it impossible. We understand a lot of things now that we didn't understand 10 years ago. They're not impossible now because we understand them. They weren't impossible 10 years ago when we didn't understand them. Dr. Gish came back to the second law again. Pure baloney, in my opinion. The second law is very hard to understand, and in my opinion, his whole argument is falls exactly into the traps I pointed out that it would probably fall into. The open system and the closed, you just must make the distinction, and it does not, second law does not stop things from involving. It stops, on the average, things from getting more complicated. But some things get less complicated and some get more in an open system like the universe, let's say. Even this, closed system like the universe, excuse me. Some things can go up and some down, and that's exactly what we see. We see stars in general losing their energy, going more and more to disorder. Not all of them. We also see the opposite process. We see stars being formed right now. We can see stars and watch with using what we know of the standard physical theory that holds here on Earth. We can watch those stars with infrared. We can't really see the best of them with visible light, but we can see them in infrared now. We can watch them forming. We can calculate how long it's going to take, how long it has taken. There's a tremendous evolution of stars. This is not biological evolution. This is evolution of stars, and it's very well calculated using current laws of physics. The sun at this point is about 5 billion years old. There's a tremendous amount of evidence for this. There are models of the sun using current physical laws that tell us very much how the sun is operating, how it was 1 billion years ago, what's going to happen in the next billion, what's going to happen in 5 billion, which is going to get pretty hot for us in 5 billion as it becomes a red giant star. One last thing, molecular biology. Dr. Gish brought up, and I thought maybe there's something to say a little more about. At this point, you know, the experiment is on, the great quest is on to find the genome of man, which as I understand that, is really to get the complete sequences in the DNA inside man. It's a tremendous project, but it's moving. It's already been found, again, in these last few years, since when we've been able to work with molecular biology, we've been able to compare chromosome sequences in gorilla, chimpanzee, man, orangutan, and the biologists have been able to make a nice series. None of these going from one of the others, but all coming from common ancestors, and they can even estimate the lengths of time it's taken. It's very interesting to go into this. I remember how fascinated I was when I first saw the first paper really laying out a lot of this. There's a tremendous amount of brand new information. To the best of my knowledge, all of it is in agreement with evolution. Not necessarily with a given theory of evolution, but with evolution. I don't know of anything that is not. And I have not heard any other possibilities. One last thing, I guess. Dr. Gish says there's been no relationship between man, apes, any of these things. What would we expect? Say if man is related to a frog. Well, let's say we'd expect some kind of a bony structure that'd be somewhat similar. The closer the relationship appears to be, the closer we would expect things. At some point we could start talking about chromosome sequences. It turns out that they're tremendously similar. It doesn't look to me like it's anything that happened at all randomly. I think there's a definite genealogical descent, and everything does hold together. Not that we know everything. I don't think we'll ever know everything. I think the world's too complicated, but there's such a tremendous amount of fun in trying to find out that I think scientists are going to continue to try. And a lot of it does pay off. It doesn't always pay. Sometimes it's worth no practical value. Other times it helps us tremendously in understanding what we're going to do. Thank you very much.
Dr. Gish, you now have 15 minutes.
Now, Dr. Donaldson said that he didn't believe there was any conflict between science and religion. I totally agree with that statement. There's no contradictions, there are no conflicts between the truth on either side here. I do think there's a conflict, however, between the concept of God, an omniscient, omnipotent God, who created and this idea of evolution, which is based upon genetic mistakes, almost all of which are bad and produce all these horrible bad things. And then this so-called rare good mutant supposedly replaced the original by death of the less fit. To me, that is totally inconsistent with the omnipotent, omniscient God and the attributes of that God. So there is a conflict there, not between science and religion. I believe in science. I'm a practicing scientist. We creation scientists are creationists because we are scientists, because we believe in science. Now, he quoted the Creation Research Society statement. May I point out, ladies and gentlemen, that evolutionists are just as dogmatic or more dogmatic than any statement of the Creation Research Society. They say evolution is a fact, evolution is a fact, evolution is a fact. You just see that over and over and over again in the evolutionary literature. That is dogma. About as dogmatic as anything can be. Now, you can question a particular phylogeny, you can question a certain mechanism of evolution. Yes, you can do that. But one thing you must never question is the fact of evolution. We creation scientists, we submit articles to standard journals. If we just hint that evolution is wrong or that creation is a credible explanation, it goes right in the wastebasket. It never sees the light of day because of this dogmatic control of our educational and scientific establishments by evolutionists. Now, I'm glad that Dr. Donaldson mentioned the Grand Canyon. Ladies and gentlemen, if you know the history of the Grand Canyon, if you know that Grand Canyon, you know it's not evidence for evolution at all. Evolutionists said for a long time that the Colorado River cut the Grand Canyon. That's absolutely impossible, and they know it now. Geologists know that because they believe the Kaibab Plateau, that great monocline that we have there, was uplifted 65 million years ago. But they believe the Colorado River only began 4 million years ago. Now, if you have that huge hill there and the Colorado River comes along 60 million years later, it's not going to climb up and down the hill and cut a canyon, it's going to run right around it. Besides, there's 1,000 cubic miles of material that's been cut out of that canyon. Go down river and look for it. You don't see it down there. It's not down there in the delta. What you find is 600 feet of limestone, not sandstone and stuff like that. And they're left without any reasonable theory on how the Grand Canyon formed, utilizing the general uniformitarian, slow, gradual evolutionary processes. Now, furthermore, you go down to the bottom of the Grand Canyon, the Precambrian, what do you find? You don't find any jellyfish, worms, brachiopods, clams, or snails there. But you find that uplifted and beveled off, and right on top is the Cambrian. What do you find in those Cambrian rocks? All those complicated invertebrates. You don't see any evolution there. Boom, there they are. And if you go up the wall of the canyon, you can't pull out any intermediate form. There's none there. And furthermore, we have the Mississippian lying on top of the Cambrian. That means there's more than 200 million years missing. If that thing had been sitting there for 200 million years, later, you see there's no Ordovician, there's no Silurian, no Devonian there, just the Mississippian. That's 200 million years missing. And then they believe later on, 200 million years later, then sedimentation occurred again. Now, if that sat there for 200 million years, what would happen? Folding, buckling, faulting, erosion, so forth and so on. It'd be visible signs of it. 200 million years. And yet, the Mississippian is sitting right on top of the Cambrian, just like that. You can't see any 200 million years missing there. It doesn't fit evolution at all. There's all kinds of problems from the evolutionary point of view, but marvelous support for the creationist point of view in the Grand Canyon. Now, furthermore, at the present rate of erosion, you could erode all the continents down to waterline in 15 million years. That is, take the total quantity of sediment that's being eroded off the continents today per year, multiply it times 15 million years, and you'd get all those continents right down to water level. That means if my calculations are correct, the continents should have been eroded down to water level 250,000 times in 4 billion years. But we haven't even eroded them down once yet. We still have these so-called ancient continents. That is totally inconsistent with this evolutionary point of view. Dr. Donaldson mentioned horses. Did you notice what he showed? Eohippus, by the way, is not a horse. A lot of evolutionists don't even believe it's related to a horse. It's more similar to a coney or a hyrax than it is to a horse. They adopted it as a horse, but it has Did you notice the 4 toes? And then what about the next horse? Had 3 toes, didn't it? Did you see any intermediate form? Did you see any 2.5 toes or anything like that? No, you don't see anything like that, or 3.5. Then you go from a 3-toed horse to a 1-toed horse. Those jumps are sudden, and evolutionists have said there are no transitional forms. Richard Goldschmidt, in an article he published many years ago, he says, first of all, he says, and I quote, this is from Goldschmidt, American scientist, January of 1952, he says, the facts of greatest general importance are the following. When a new phylum, class, or order appears, there follows a quick explosive, in terms of geological time, diversification, so that practically all orders or families known appear suddenly and without any apparent transitions. End of quote. This evolutionist says phyla, classes, orders, families, the major basic types appear abruptly without transitional forms. Concerning the horses, he said this: moreover, within the slowly evolving series, like the famous horse series, the decisive steps are abrupt without transitions. Here's an article appeared in the Houston Chronicle, Wednesday, November 5th, 1980, by Boyce Rensberger. He's quoting the leading evolutionists of that day concerning the controversy in evolutionary theory. And he says this: the popularly told example of horse evolution, suggesting a gradual sequence of changes from 4-toed fox-sized creatures living nearly 50 million years ago to today's much larger 1-toed horse, has long been known to be wrong. Instead of gradual change, fossils of each intermediate species appear fully distinct, persist unchanged, and then become extinct. Transitional forms are unknown. Yes, we have different kinds of horses. Well, we have different kinds of primates, don't we? We have monkeys, we have apes, and we have people. But we don't have transitional forms. If all those things got buried right now and evolutionists came along a million years later, why, there's a nice transitional series. There's monkeys, there's apes, and there's people. But there are no intermediates, you see. Right now we know apes are apes and people are people. And that's the same thing true with these so-called horses. Now, I can't understand why somebody just can't understand the second law of thermodynamics, ladies and gentlemen. Now, Dr. Donaldson himself said it applies to a closed system. There's no question about that. The universe is a closed system, and therefore it does apply to the origin of the universe. You cannot account for the origin of the universe. It could not have created itself. Now, furthermore, if you have an open system, just bringing in energy doesn't do anything. Why, you know, what do you have to do to get a car to go uphill? Does a car just spontaneously run uphill? I should say not. That violates the laws of thermodynamics. Of course. Cars spontaneously run downhill. But you can get a car to go uphill without violating the second law of thermodynamics. Of course you can do that. But now Dr. Donaldson says all you need to do is apply energy. Okay, let's do that, shall we? We take a can of gasoline, pour it over the car, and light a match. Does it go up a hill? I should say not. It goes up in smoke, doesn't it? But now, if you put that gasoline, which is chemical energy, into the gas tank, which is fed into what? A motor. Now the motor can convert that chemical energy into mechanical energy, which drives the car uphill. No problem with the second law of thermodynamics. But you see, you've got to have a motor. You've got to have a proper energy conversion machine. Here on Earth, we have these energy conversion machines. They're called green plants. And green plants can absorb the visible light of the sun. I can convert that visible light into chemical energy. Why? Because they have photosynthesis. But photosynthesis is incredibly complex. And you have to have all that other machinery in the green plant. Sure, there's no problem. No problem with the second law of thermodynamics, converting the seed into a tree. As long as you've got the seed, as long as you've got photosynthesis, as long as you have all that metabolic machinery, as long as you have all that genetic information there's no problem. But where did that come from in the first place? You see, if everything tends to run down and deteriorate, how could simple molecules spontaneously, just with energy, build themselves up? Oh, they say lightning could do that. Boom. Well, did you ever get hit by lightning? What happened to you? Did you become more complex, more ordered? Did you go up to something bigger and better? I should say not. You get obliterated, don't you? Lightning doesn't do anything like that. Neither does ultraviolet light. Ultraviolet light destroys. What about molecular biology? Well, Dr. Denton, you heard what he said. Molecular biology is against evolution. And ladies and gentlemen, we would expect a considerable degree of similarity in our biochemistry of all living organisms. Of course we would, wouldn't we? We live in the same world, we breathe the same air, we drink the same water, and eat the same food. Why, if you put one kind of amino acids in plants, then God put a different kind of amino acids in animals, and then God put a third type of amino acids in you and I, what could we eat? We couldn't eat plants, we couldn't eat animals. The only thing we could eat would be each other. That wouldn't be a very nice solution. And once you must have that similarity. Your biochemistry must be similar. But as pointed out by Dr. Denton, there are numerous contradictions between that notion and the evolutionary hypothesis. How much time do I have, Dr. McAllister?
You've got 3 minutes and 40 seconds.
3 minutes, okay, all right. Now, the molecular biology Dr. Denton points out, and others have pointed out, Christian Schwabe and Gregory Warr published an article in the journal, it was in the Perspectives in Biology and Medicine, spring of 1984. Now these scientists are evolutionists, but what they found was this: their study of various proteins, the relaxins, for example, the hormone relaxin, which causes a relaxation of the birth canal during birth, that doesn't fit any idea of evolution. It doesn't fit any tree, any evolutionary tree. It's totally contradictory to this evolutionary tree you get from the cytochrome. The same is true of the myoglobins. The same is true of many insulins. There are much contradictions to this idea that you have an evolutionary phylogenetic tree based upon DNA and proteins. Many contradictions. And so that evidence, as Dr. Denton has pointed out, is more and more and more is contradicting the basic assumptions of evolutionary theory. Now, what about embryology? It hadn't come up as I've heard here tonight, but you see it in the textbooks. Right now in the textbooks used in the schools of California, we have this idea of embryological recapitulation. The idea that the human embryo, as it develops, it recapitulates its evolutionary history. It looked like a fish, then a tadpole, and so forth until it becomes human. That is known to be false. It's known to be thoroughly discredited. Evolutionists know that it is. I debated Ashley Montague a number of years ago at Princeton University, and I made that statement. He says, yes, that's right. He said, no evolutionist should ever use that discredited theory. And yet it is used right now in the textbooks in California. Listen, a human embryo never has gill slits. In the human embryo, there's certain structures in the neck region that look similar to certain structures in the fish, but it's strictly superficial. In the neck region of the human, it never develops into slits, doesn't open into the throat, never becomes slit. It never becomes gills. There are no gills ever in the existence of a human embryo. Now, if it doesn't have gills and it doesn't have slits, one thing is certain, it doesn't have gill slits, does it? You see, there's no evidence there at all. The embryology of a human is uniquely human at every point. And the homology, the similarities in different animals that we find, the evidence related to these homologous structures is totally contradictory to evolutionary theory. These homologous structures, where they develop from in the embryo, is different in many animals. And if they're homologous, if they're really as a result of evolution, they should develop from the same tissue, but they do not. Furthermore, the genes that control similar structures in different animals are totally different. And therefore, that is contradictory to the notion that these similar structures in different animals have evolved from a common ancestor. The evidence is contradictory. The creation scientist says these similarities exist because we have a master creator, a master engineer, who used similar solutions for similar problems. Now, we would then summarize our position again, ladies and gentlemen, that when we take the total weight of the evidence, ask ourselves the question, which model of origins do the data fit best, creation or evolution? We find that the overwhelming scientific evidence supports the creationist position. Thank you very much.
Now we'll ask Dr. Donaldson to come back to the podium for a 5-minute rebuttal and summary.
Incidentally, I think you probably can see the second law of thermodynamics at work every time I walk over here. breaking down these days, not building up very much. It does happen. On the other hand, I set a personal record for the 250-yard swim the other day, so I guess there's some building up can still happen, even as we're getting older there. Okay. I really haven't heard any scientific evidence for creationism. I hear a great deal of evidence, most of which is rather shaky, against different evolutionary theories. Most of that evidence is not really against punctuated equilibrium, the one that I talked about. In fact, Dr. Gish talked about these things appear as stair steps. Those are exactly Stephen Gould's words as he explains what punctuated equilibrium is all about. I really have heard not a single piece of evidence that I can remember. I tried to write down everything, which I would consider as scientific evidence for creationism. I've heard things against evolution, but I've heard nothing really for creationism, for a modern, a young Earth. I've heard none of that. I've heard none that says God did it. This is when He did it, or something. You know, I haven't heard that. I've heard a lot that says He must do it. He must have done it because it's impossible otherwise. But that is not a valid argument. The facts, as we best know them, from geology, that's the layering, all this stuff, putting it all together. From geophysics, we're talking about radioactive dating. We're talking about seafloor spreading. We're talking about the magnetic reversals, which appear in the seafloor spreading. They appear in successive layers of lava, right? In Oregon, for instance, there's lots of this where you can date layers of lava by the actual magnetic reversals. In astronomy, for instance, we've been able to measure distances to stars. It's been a big job. There have been some very nicely worked out things to find distances to stars. You remember you read a year and a half ago about the first big supernova that we've really been able to see naked eye since the time of Johannes Kepler, way back in the 1600s. We had one. Unfortunately, it was down farther, too far south, and we couldn't see it from here. But it's been a subject of tremendous study. We know the distance of that star. It's 180,000 light years away, approximately. That means that the event which we just saw happened 180,000 years ago. That's what light years mean. That thing has not just been sitting there and suddenly occurred, unless God made the light 10,000 years ago very close to Earth, and as if it came from that star. I don't think God would play games like that. My God wouldn't. He wants us to use our heads and try to understand things. Dr. Gish said that molecular biology is developing bigger and bigger problems with evolution. I do not believe that molecular biologists believe that. He loves to use the standard argument, the appeal to authority, which is one of the items laid on the back of your program as one of the things you're supposed to look out for as being misleading. He quotes people constantly, evolutionists or non-evolutionists. You know, I've done it occasionally, but I've tried mostly to stick to quoting him or Dr. Morris, who is the other head person at the Institute for Creation Science, as I understand it. Incidentally, I think he taught freshman engineering lab to me when I was at Rice. I'm not absolutely sure, but when I first saw his name 10 years ago in this other thing, I thought, I think I know him. And I'm pretty sure he taught me then. He was there at the time. Okay, there's one last little thing. Take that San Andreas Fault again. If it continues to move as it is now, and we can watch it to 1 centimeter per year, in 60 million years, LA will be right alongside Alaska. I don't think there's any reason to expect that 60 million years earlier, it wasn't about that same distance farther down. There's no reason whatever to think that the laws of nature have changed and thrown that all out. And when there's no reason, and in addition, we get the geological evidence that it was so. We can go back a few thousands of years and line up across that fault and see where things, even river channels, lined up and have now been done this kind of thing. They were like this and they've been replaced. Thank you very much.
I'd like to thank you all for your questions.
No, he gets a rebuttal, second rebuttal.
Well, I would still like to thank you for your questions. And now we'll ask Dr. Gish back. Thank you, John.
Well, I can hardly blame Dr. McAllister, ladies and gentlemen. Probably all of us are a bit confused after this evening. But I really do hope that what we've presented has been helpful in many, many ways. Now, Dr. Donaldson said we have not presented any evidence for creation, only evidence against evolution. Well, actually, nothing's really wrong with that. It's really not true. But, for example, Dr. R.D. Alexander, professor of zoology at the University of Michigan, in one of the anti-creationist book, he said, creation and evolution in some respects imply backgrounds about as different as one can imagine, in the sense that creation is an alternative to evolution for any specific question. A case against creation is a case for evolution, and vice versa. So whether I presented any positive evidence for creation, I presented negative evidence against evolution, and that's all you'd have to do because there's only two possibilities. However, I have presented positive, powerful, positive evidence for creation. I said, what would we expect if creation is true? The sudden appearance, fully formed, of the basic types of animals and plants, and that is what we have. As even the evolutionist Goldschmidt said, the phyla, classes, orders, and families, all of these major types appear suddenly and without any intermediate forms. And notice I presented a challenge. If you have these little microscopic organisms, and then you have all those vast array of invertebrates, hundreds of millions of years of evolution, why don't we have any transitional forms? Notice what I said, all of those invertebrates, and then we have fishes, 100 million years in between. Why don't we have any transitional form? Did Dr. Donaldson offer one single word in explanation? No, total silence. He had absolutely no answer to why we don't have any ancestors for the vertebrates or for the invertebrates. Why? Because there is no answer, you see. That establishes beyond doubt. I challenged him with the butterfly metamorphosis. Here's an evolutionary puzzle. How does a caterpillar convert itself slowly and gradually into a butterfly? How do you do that? By evolution. Come on now, let's have an explanation. After all, it's simple chemistry and physics and biology and mutations and natural selection, all that. There ought to be some idea what the intermediates would have looked like, how they would have functioned, how they would have been superior, how they would have replaced the original, what that intermediate would have looked like. But I did not hear one single word about explanation for that, and those were my major points. And the probability arguments, how do you answer that argument, ladies and gentlemen? Just sit down and calculate the probability that a monkey typing at random would produce a single sentence. To be or not to be, that is the question. Figure that out. See how long it would take a monkey to type that out. It would take billions and billions of years by chance. Ladies and gentlemen, it's simple mathematics, it's simple science, nothing difficult about it. This is tremendous, powerful evidence for deliberate, intelligent creation, design, and purpose that we see everywhere about us. If you were walking along a hillside and you glanced down, you saw some rocks and pebbles, well, of course, you would conclude, would you not, they formed naturally by time and chance? Of course you would. But if you saw an arrowhead, what would you conclude? The arrowhead was the product of deliberate, intelligent creation. Furthermore, you wouldn't believe that a beaver did it, or a snake did it, or a monkey did it. That arrowhead, you would believe, could only be produced by a human being with the intelligence and the ability of a human being to shape it and form it. It had design, it had purpose. It was deliberately shaped. Of course, you would believe that it had a creator. Well, a living cell is infinitely more complex than an arrowhead. And the living organisms that we see are infinitely more complex than an arrowhead. And so that you see the evidence for design and purpose demands intelligent, deliberate creation. Now, the matter of time we've not discussed tonight. I said it was not an issue. If we could have been over to the seminar tonight, hear Dr. Stephen Austin, our geologist, to talk about that, we hear much about it. And we want to have a debate on ourselves to that question tonight. How did the universe, how did living things originate? Where did you come from? Ladies and gentlemen, I submit that's an incredibly important question. Listen, what we believe about where we came from determines largely about what we believe, what we're doing here now, and where we'll be in the future. Our young people are literally being brainwashed in a mechanistic, naturalistic theory of evolution. As a result, they're sitting there and say, look, I started as nothing but a cloud of hydrogen gas. My only destiny is a pile of dust. There is no God. There is no one to whom I am responsible. I am only responsible to myself. Now, many people approve of that. They like that theory.
Dr.
We
Gish,
don't
I'm
like
sorry,
it.
but you're out of time.
And so we want our young people to know there is tremendous evidence that in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Thank you.
Now we'll take a maximum of 20 minutes. We're already running late. That the format will be a two-minute response from the debater to whom the question is presented, and a 1-minute rebuttal from the other debater. I've excluded any undirected question, any unreadable question, any question too long, and I have combined several questions that are asking the same thing. We'll ask the debaters to simply speak from their tables, and we'll start with Dr. Gish. A couple of 3 questions here about the same thing. It's my understanding that it takes light from a distant star up to 1 million years to reach Earth. How does this time frame fit into the creation model? And if the moon is billions of years old, it would collect very much meteoric dust in that time. How does this compare with what we have discovered by being on the moon?
Well, there are several questions there. The first question has to do with the light from the stars. Now, our model involves the theistic supernatural creation. If one reads in the Bible what God said, He created stars to be for signs and seasons on the earth, we'd have to see them immediately. And so that light which we see, we would have to see immediately. That means it could not have left the star. If the star or galaxy is billions of light years away, obviously it did not leave that star, but it was created in between. That is, God created those things so we could see them immediately. Now, of course, one who's totally sold out to a mechanistic, naturalistic explanation would totally reject that because there is no God, you see. That would be our primary response to that suggestion. Now, of course, the creationists who believe that things are very old, no problem. The light really did come from that star or that galaxy because it was created billions of years before the earth was created. Now, as far as the meteoritic dust, well, evolutionists were quite content with the previous determinations, the influx of meteoritic dust before we got to the moon. One of the best determinations, 14 million tons per year. 4.5 billion years, we ought to have about 50 to 100 feet of dust on the moon from this meteoritic dust coming in from space. Well, of course, we found only a thin layer, and so they've all now decided that we are grossly in error in such determination. But one of the problems for that is this, is one of the major routes for producing dust on the moon was not influx of meteoritic dust, but the influx of radiation, cosmic rays, X-rays, and solar wind and so forth. Since there's no atmosphere on the moon, this radiation strikes the surface of the moon unimpeded. And you can calculate the rate at which the surface rocks and other material would crumble to dust under the impact of that radiation. R.A. Littleton, a British scientist, published that in 1956. He said we ought to have miles of dust on the moon from this process alone, but we only have a thin layer of dust. That does pose some sort of a problem.
Thank you, Dr. Gish. And Dr. Donaldson, 1-minute rebuttal.
Well, I'm confident that Dr. Middleton calculated wrong about his turning the surface of the moon to dust. We have very good evidence, including direct dating of rocks from the surface of the moon, that the moon is about 4.5 billion years old. I think, really uncontroverted evidence if we look at what the radioactive dating has done. Again, it's things that are very much in agreement with each other, not a single method, but many. The face of the moon itself seems to be in agreement with that. The crater history of the moon has been worked at pretty hard, and it's pretty well understood how old some of these craters are. There were tremendous impacts back in the earlier days of the solar system. Some of these craters are bigger than bigger than California. That's not true. It's that plus all the ejecta are perhaps bigger. Is that my minute? I didn't say it. Sure, you started with a minute, so you couldn't give me a sign. Sorry.
Sorry about that. A question for Dr. Donaldson concerning continuing evolution. Do you know of any continuous complex growth of elementary elements any continuous growth of elementary elements to complex elements on any massive stage? There's a question regarding the mutation work done on fruit flies. Has there been any evidence there that proves evolution? And why do we not see the formation of man evolving to this day from lesser forms, or for that matter, any other form?
I'm not sure I understand the question, but I'll try my best to answer what I did catch. Yeah, I think I've pointed out that there's tremendous evidence of evolution all the way from single-celled critters to the crowning glory of it all, woman. There's been a tremendous evolution, and the rocks are full of the evidence. I'm not sure. There may have been more points to that question, which were some things that I just could not understand.
Primarily, do we see evidence today of evolution, evolutionary movement today that we can go out and see intermediate forms?
Oh, well, of course. Every time you get the flu, you'll read in the paper what they've been doing. This is a new strain. It's evolved away, not every time, but frequently. It's a new strain. The particular virus has evolved away from the one which we became immune to 3 years ago, and it's a new strain. It's happening constantly. Okay.
You've got a minute.
Oh, another minute. Okay. Let's see, the viruses, there was another. Oh, of course, the insect immunities. We keep spraying everything with DDT for a few years. Okay, so before long, a new group of insects, they look similar, but their insides are different. They're now immune, or nearly immune, to the effects of DDT. So they can go in and thrive in the presence of DDT. This kind of thing is happening constantly. Evolution is appearing right before us in answer to changes in the environment every day.
All right, go ahead.
Well, you see, if that's the way we define evolutionists, we're all evolutionists. But you see what Dr. Donaldson is talking about, mere variation within the species. As he said, strains. You start with the fruit fly, for example. Poor little fruit fly has been subjected to radiation for hundreds and hundreds of generations and all these mutations. What do you have today? A fruit fly. You see, it hadn't become a bumblebee or a mosquito. It hadn't even become a different species. And that is strains of viruses. Viruses do undergo mutation. By the way, viruses aren't living anyhow. They're nothing more than a DNA or an RNA molecule surrounded by protein. The only way they replicate, they don't replicate, they are replicated by the living cell. But you get these strains, you get these minor variations within a species. That's not evolution. We started with the peppered moth 100 years ago. We changed from predominantly light-colored form to a predominantly dark-colored form because of the pollution. But the peppered moth is still a peppered moth, Biston bacillard. You see, there's no evolution there. Where did the moth come from in the first place? Where did birds come from? Where did tigers come from? That's the question, and that is the question not being addressed here, you see.
Thank you, Dr. Gish.
Just one word, everybody but creationists think both of those cases are evolution.
All right, a question for Dr. Gish. Several questions. You spent your time disproving the evidence for evolution. Can we hear some evidence supporting creation, and when did it happen?
Well, I thought I just did that in my rebuttal. The positive evidence for creation, as one of the evolutionists said, I think it was Douglas Fujiyama in his book, an evolutionist, he said, Either creatures arose gradually from pre-existing forms, in which case evolution is true, or they appeared fully formed on this planet. And if they did appear fully formed, then they must have been created by some omnipotent intelligence. And that is precisely what the evidence reveals. The basic types. Ladies and gentlemen, look, there are no transitional forms between the phyla. That's the greatest division of animal life. There's no question about it. I was debating Beverly Halstead at Reading University in England a number of years ago. And he made that statement to the audience. He said, look, I'll admit we have no transitional forms between phyla. That settles the matter, ladies and gentlemen. Evolution demands continuity. You cannot have any breaks. There must be a continuous flow of one thing into another. Ladies and gentlemen, that is absolutely contrary to the fossil record. That is powerful, positive evidence for creation. I spoke 1 minute. Did I have 2 minutes?
You have 1 more minute.
1 more minute. Okay, I thought you were flagging me down. Now, furthermore, ladies and gentlemen, the evidence for purposefulness, the evidence for design, the evidence that we see is just so plain. The trilobites, supposed to become extinct 200 million years ago, that little invertebrate. The eyes are still intact because its lenses are composed of calcite or inorganic crystalline calcium carbonate. Scientists have studied the optics of those little trilobites, those eyes, and they had perfect, undistorted vision. And they said it's just as if those eyes had been designed by a physicist. And then they went on to say, isn't it great what evolution can do? Blind evolution. The evidence for design, and the designer was there, but they refused to believe it.
Thank you, Dr. Donaldson. Rebut, 1 minute.
I have nothing to add to that.
All right, a question for Dr. Donaldson. If life did evolve from a single living cell, how do evolutionists explain the existence of over 50,000 types of one-celled organisms today?
I guess the intent of that question is, if we started with a single cell and evolved everything else, how can there be any single cells left? My understanding of evolution is not that every cell had to evolve, that if anything is a satisfactory organism in its environment, it can remain right there, that some other cell, it may be an almost identical cell to start with, will have a mutation, start off on a new line. I believe that's the standard understanding of evolution, that some of the original things stay put, some move away due to mutations. And if we take just the simple idea that natural selection then governs, if the new thing is viable in its environment, it'll be selected and will continue. Maybe it'll kill out the old one, maybe it won't, depending on how the competition goes, what they do in their different environments. So it may go on and on to other things. I believe that's the standard explanation of evolution, and it certainly seems very reasonable to me.
All right, thank you very much. Dr. Gish, 1 minute rebut.
Yes. Well, the Darwinian idea, the very Darwinian idea was this, is there's a limit. So only a certain number of organisms of each species can exist. Therefore, when you have a mutant which is good, the good mutant now in competition with the original must replace it. Because there's just a certain number can exist, and if this mutant, which begins as a tiny fraction of the population, increases, it must do that by eliminating the original. And so you replace the original, that's why evolution occurs. Indeed, why do we still have these little microscopic organisms today? As a matter of fact, Pierre Grasset, this famous French zoologist, said that bacteria give absolutely no evidence for evolution. They reproduce every 18 minutes or so. Boy, there's where you ought to find plenty of evidence for evolution. Hey, start with E. coli. I don't care how many years ago you start with E. coli, you have E. coli today. You don't have any evolution there. No change.
Thank you very much. Dr. Gish, your third and last question. Where do dinosaurs fit into the theory of creation, and how do you explain their sudden demise?
Well, if you accept the progressive creationist point of view of those creationists who believe the earth is very, very old, they believe that God created each creature at a certain time. Later on, then he created other creatures. Say he created those invertebrates 600 million years ago, then he created fishes 100 million years later, then he created amphibians 50 million years later, and so forth and so on. Now, there'd be no problem then to explaining where the dinosaurs fit in such a concept of creation. They were created, they would believe, beginning about 225 million years ago, and became extinct 70 million years ago. Now, those who believe in a recent creation and a literal creation, as described in the Bible, would believe that these creatures did coexist. But they did coexist with man and became extinct following the flood, which is described in the Bible. Actually, the facts of geology, though, show that there was a tremendous change in climate. The Earth at one time had a worldwide mild climate. Greenland had a climate very similar to the Caribbean. We found fossils, graveyards of duck-billed dinosaurs on the north shore of Alaska, and other dinosaurs clear down the southern tip of South America. There have been tremendous changes in climate on this Earth, and we believe that is the reason that the dinosaurs became extinct. Now, evolutionists have suggested perhaps 1,000 different reasons why they think dinosaurs become extinct. What do we say? Nobody really knows, because we don't have any real record history of what happened then. We can only infer what may have happened.
Thank you very much. Dr. Donaldson, a rebut.
Well, I think it's well understood by now with the way that the plate tectonics has worked out just in the last 30 years, that England was at a much lower latitude in a milder climate 20, 60 million years back. It's pretty well understood. In addition, the Cretaceous time, 136 million years back on for a while, up to 65, was a warmer time. It's the big coal farming time. Most of our coal has come from that period, which was a period of warm temperatures and heavy vegetation. This is something that evolution certainly supports, and in addition, geophysics in the business of the continental drift, the plate tectonics, certainly agrees with the fossil finds. They're not anything that's hard to explain at all.
Thank you very much, sir. And a final question for Dr. Donaldson. Earlier you said that as a scientist and evolutionist that I believe in nothing. That may or may not be a correct quote. Yet then you said the age of the geological records are absolute. Can you reconcile this within the framework of evolution?
Would you say what my quote was again? It didn't sound at all familiar to me.
As a scientist, all is written here, as a scientist, I believe in nothing. I think that's not an exact quote.
I don't think it's even in the ballpark. I have no idea what he's talking about. I certainly am not in a situation where I believe in nothing. I feel I'm a strongly religious person and a strongly scientific person.
When you said you were coming against the statement that the creation is science, and they said we will always believe in creation, you said as a scientist, I believe in nothing forever.
I certainly did not say that. What I said is that a scientist would never sign a statement saying that I now believe and will always believe in something, because it's important to watch the evidence. That's the whole point of science, to try to base your conclusions and be flexible. Scientists change their conclusions. When Einstein came along, Einstein's mechanics replaced
We can't
Newton's.
have any more words from the floor, thank you.
May I comment very briefly?
Excuse me, Dr. Gish, but excuse me.
Yeah, he gets
Oh,
one.
did you finish? Did you finish?
Well,
Dr.?
his time is not up if he wishes to
Oh,
relinquish.
I'm through. I think I've answered.
Thanks
Dr.
very
Gish
much.
has a shot at it.
I want to emphasize again, ladies and gentlemen, evolutionists are very, very dogmatic. They assert evolution is a fact, evolution is a fact, evolution is a fact. They assert it, they say it's just as much a fact as the earth is round and the earth goes around the sun. That's the way they put it. Listen, that is dogma. That is frozen dogma. That is a belief. They just believe it, and they believe it just as much as any creationist believes in creation. We creationists, we can change our mind about things. We have changed our mind. We have made changes since, say, in the last 100 years. The testable subsidiary hypotheses that we have from our general creation model are testable. And if they're shown to be false, then those are abandoned. The idea back in the time of Darwin, the creation had that species were rigid, that all species were created just as they then existed. We don't believe that today because we know that dogs and coyotes and jackals and wolves are interfertile and they produce fertile offspring. Therefore, we believe they are one created kind, even though man arbitrarily puts them in separate species. And so creationists have changed. They're not rigid. No more rigid, certainly, than evolutionists. I would like to ask Dr. Donaldson, do you believe evolution to be a fact? Is it just a tentative hypothesis that you hold, you're willing to drop the moment there's any contradictory evidence, or do you believe, would you say it as a fact?
Thank you very much, and you're invited to respond, John.
May I answer?
Yes, definitely, and then that will be the end of our question and answer period.
I don't know very much about the theories of evolution. I do believe evolution to be a fact in this very much the same way that I believe in Einstein's general relativity to be a fact, with the evidence to be weighed carefully. It's a tentative conclusion. It's nothing that I would feel could never change. And the same is true with Einstein. In fact, there's been a tremendous amount of experimental evidence in the last 10 years giving much greater strength to Einstein's general relativity. I had a fascinating time reading the new book about that. This is, I believe, the scientific method.
All right, thank you very much.
You've been a wonderful audience. Thank you.
And we thank you very much for your presence this evening. Good night now.